Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Julie Rudolph from Divergent Rehab, and I'm here with Kyle from Freedom Running Club in Florida. So, Kyle and I have been having some great chats lately about all things running, blending that rehab and PT side with a coaching perspective. And today we're excited to dive deep into a topic we both get asked a lot about. Probably Kyle gets asked more about it: carbs, carbohydrates, when to use them, how to use them, and why they matter before and after your runs. So, Kyle, let's jump in.
hmm
Well, first, how's your day going before we really kind of dive into things?
Everything is fantastic. How are you, Julie?
I'm doing good. It's a lot of rain here, so I'm waiting for some sunshine. But what are you gonna
Yeah.
do?
What can you do?
Yeah, exactly. So, what comes to mind when I think about carbs? I mean, I love carbs, they make me happy, but I know not everyone feels the same way and not everyone understands why they're important with running. So, what comes to mind to you, Kyle, when you think about carbs and runners?
Well, for me, I think about carbohydrates primarily as your rocket fuel, right? Like you can't run
Mhm.
fast without carbohydrates in your system. And there's really no ifs, ands, or buts about that. No matter how you're trying to train low or any of these other new fad things about carnivore diets and all that, if you want to have quick, explosive movements for longer than 6 to 7 seconds, which most of these races are going to be, we're not dealing with 100-meter runners to take longer than that. You need carbohydrates. They are sustained fast fuel. And I know we talked about this a little bit in a previous video. That comes from the shape of the molecules. They're simple, they're like a circle, so your body can break them down. But I think something that's really interesting, and one of the things we're going to get into today, is that it's underlooked how important carbohydrates are for recovery for people too. And the fact that carbohydrates, we think usually, protein after a hard effort, but if you don't have those carbohydrates, your muscles can't grow either. So I think that people need to always think about these things. They're macronutrients for a reason. They do a lot of things in the body. And I'm trying to get myself to even retrain that carbohydrates are not just fast fuel. There are things that your body needs to also build and recover from sustained effort. And I think that's really exciting too, that we're starting to see that this super important nutrient, your body's preferred fuel source, is not just for fuel, it's also for restructuring. So I'm old enough to remember the fact that going back years, carbs were a thing everybody ate, and then
Mhm.
proteins and fats were the demon, and it's kind of shifted back the other way. And in all things, we want to get back to that baseline, the idea that we need all of these things in moderation, and carbs having this multi-dimensional approach, I think is really interesting and worth further exploration.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think back to school, you were taught this is nutrition and this is what you're educated on and this is what it is, right? With protein, fat, and carbs. And then things shift outside of that. You always come back to that framework. But then whether it's social media or other things that are coming out, just different fads, people shift to protein or they shift out of carbs. But it's always you'll come back to what how it was structured before. You'd mentioned the fueling side of things. Maybe we could break it down for everyone that's watching here on what that means. So the different kinds of carbs you talked about recovery, like the difference between a simple carb versus something that's a little bit more complex, and when you would typically use them with running.
Yeah, definitely. So the complex carbohydrates are going to be more, for lack of a better terms, whole foods. If you think about them, you're going to get things that have more fiber in them, more the way that it looked when it was picked off the tree or taken out of the ground. Things that are a little bit more, minimally processed are going to be a little bit more complex, and something that's more broken down is more simple. And for a runner, you kind of want to think about everything again for its purpose. A person that's maybe sedentary, taking 1,000 steps a day, would probably not benefit as much from increasing the simple fuel because, again, your body breaks it down faster. So that's kind of the generality. More of a whole food is going to be more of a complex. It's take time to digest. There's more things going on, and it looks more like it might look in nature. Where when you get to more
Mm-hmm.
simple, you're dealing with more simple sugars. Your disaccharides is a simple sugar. It's two glucose molecules, so it's easier to break down versus long chains of carbohydrates. So that's the general idea. Like it's just one step closer to being actually used by your body because essentially your body's going to break down everything into glucose and fructose for the most part. There's some other molecules that we can use too, but that's the generality. And most of these carbohydrates that you're thinking about when you're eating, again, most are going to be branch groupings of these that your body has to break down. When you're dealing with it in the actual effort, you want it to be as simple as possible. So it's one less step removed from your body being able to use it. Because if you're eating something that's super complex in a, say, 90-minute run and it's going to take 2 hours for it to break down, it's not really benefiting you. It's going to benefit you for recovery. And that's one of the things that the study that we're going to talk about today really looked into. But this idea of, when do you need this fuel? Do you need it quicker? Then you're going to want something a little more simple, less things like fiber to get into the way. So that's the
Mhm.
general way to think about it. And that's going to be things like, a runner takes things like those gels or little gummy chews or things that are much more simple, like applesauce. You know, Candy is being utilized even right now by runners. I've seen people really do different things like this, like gummy fish and things like that, because they are simple sugars. Don't work so well for me and my gut, and training your gut
Yeah.
to accept these things is part of the process of the training. But all those things that maybe would historically be considered like bad because they're simple are super beneficial for somebody right before, during your exercise, and still having them throughout the day is important because you're going to need more simple fuel. But if you were to take something that's super complex, like a whole banana, I see people do that in a race. That's even like way too complex for me because of the fiber and everything else that's in it. For lower intensity exercise, like your ultra races, where you're going to be doing this for a long period, I've seen videos of people eating like sushi in ultra races, even. But the more complex, you're going to slow down the process of getting it into your body to where it can be used. And that's what we really want. So thinking about that when you're picking, when you're taking something more complex and more simple.
No, I mean, that's a good way to think about it, right? You want something that's gonna help you when you're out there and not work against you. Can you give me what you would typically do for before your run? I was reading a lot more about it, and I definitely do like a piece of wheat bread with peanut butter on it, but now I'm like, maybe I should be trying something different. And I always feel fine with it, but I'm wondering if I'm not getting what I need prior to that run.
The key thing here is that it depends for everybody. That's worked
Mm,
really well for you. So I wouldn't go and maybe just start doing only gels or gummy fish or something like that too. So I'm typically about an hour or so before I'm having some aspect of like a pre-workout, like those waffles essentially, and they're pretty
mhm,
much mostly carbohydrates, but they have a little bit of fat and protein in them just to kind of give a little bit more satiating, which would come from the peanut
mhm,
butter and the more complex carb that you're talking about too. As I'm getting to it, I'm maybe having a sports drink that's more liquid carbohydrates, which again would fit into that simple side of things. And then when I'm getting into the actual run, that's when I'm doing my preferred gels, and I have some that work for me. We can talk about the difference between glucose and fructose and why that matters, but it doesn't have to be super complicated. I recommend for some of my runners, or even like high school runners that maybe get nervous before a run, or anybody in that
mhm,
case, if a piece of toast is all you can handle, that's better than not doing anything. And I think that's part of it too, that there's like good, better, best. And just because it's not perfect, it doesn't mean that it's not working for you. So you could also, Julie, experiment with a couple of different things.
mhm,
For whatever reason you ever find like it's a little heavy, you could maybe remove the peanut butter from it. Not that that's a bad thing at all, but if anything were to slow you down, it would be that. But maybe you try something else if you feel like at the end of the run, you don't quite have that fuel you want, maybe increasing the carbohydrates. And I haven't really talked about like grams of carbohydrates because there's different recommendations on that. I think looking in terms of like carbs per hour when you're actually running is important, but essentially you want to be topped off when you go into it. That idea of fasted running works for some people, maybe for like weight loss and things like that. But if we're dealing about like running performance, there's reasons why you might do that. Again, all these things depend on what your goals are. But if you're going into that topped off, a piece of toast with some peanut butter is a really good pre-race. I guess it just kind of depends. And what I'm talking about with like, for me personally, the waffles and everything before, that also depends on the extent. Maybe I do a half of one if it's a shorter run. If it's a
mhm.
long run, I'm definitely doing that full bit and maybe a little bit more in terms of pre-workout. So it really kind of depends, but that's the generality that I'm doing, and it's worked well for me. A piece of bread with some peanut butter is definitely a more economical option than these perform waffles or whatever that I like.
Mhm.
It's just what's worked well for me in a lot of cases. But again, it does depend, but as long as you're looking at, as you're getting closer to the effort, slightly more simple, and then in the effort, definitely the more simple the carbohydrates, the better your body can use it. And again, what you're doing matters too. If you're doing an
Mhm.
easy effort recovery run, your body can use carbohydrates and fat pretty evenly. If you're doing a
Mhm.
faster effort or a longer effort, that's where you're really going to want more carbohydrates, maybe a little bit more of a simple option. So again, it depends, and that's the tricky thing is the experimentation and getting people to train their stomach to tolerate what works for them too. That comes with some trial and error.
Yeah, for sure. And, would you say it's wrong if someone were to eat something around 30 minutes, depending on how their pre-meal went, right? Or drink a little bit, or if they just feel like you're sluggish in some way, could you start a little bit earlier in your run, or did you feel like that works against you, down the road if you're training for a marathon and you're on like a, you know, 15-mile 2-hour run?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it really is very generalized. As you increase intensity and increase
Mhm.
duration, you're going to want to fuel more often. I will say that for me personally, if I'm doing like say a 60-minute run, I'm not typically taking any fuel during it. Again, I'm taking everything I said about before and I'm
Mhm.
having a good meal quickly after. That might not work for certain people, but definitely if I'm getting longer than that, I'm probably fueling at less than 60 minutes because again, it really depends on what you're doing. In a race effort situation, you definitely want to do it earlier, right? In my
Mhm.
most recent marathon, I definitely was doing more like every 25 minutes. And toward the end, I was actually going to almost every 15, 20 minutes just to make sure that I was
Yeah.
staying topped off. And in these efforts, I think it's really useful to think about the carbohydrate and the fueling. It's never going to be something that you're actually going to replace. You're always going to be using up more than you're burning. And it's more like if you took a water bottle and dumped it out, if you're going to be done before that water bottle's totally out, like I said, in a maybe 45 to 60-minute run, then it's not necessarily, again, there's variation in this, right? There's no hard, fast
Yeah.
rules. But if you're going for longer than that and you know that that water bottle is going to be empty before you get to the end, these fueling strategies are kind of like putting your hand underneath it to slow down the drip out of the water, putting the cap
Mhm.
on partially. And that's really what you're doing here. You're never going to fully replace it. And people are going to use it at different amounts. If I'm doing a particular route, there's a route I really like for my long runs that typically goes out for a little bit and then comes back to a water station that I can grab water at if I needed to with fuel. And sometimes I just kind of forget until I get
Mhm.
there. That's roughly 50 to 60 minutes into those runs for me. I could definitely be fueling before that and maybe be feeling a little bit better. But again, it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect for it to work well for you too. But
Mhm.
experimenting, I think, is the real key. When does things work well for you? Taking note of when things work well for you, because there's variation for everybody when it comes to this.
No, for sure. Yeah, I'm thinking about your like the night or the day or 2 before even of what you're putting into your body before you go out on that long run, just as important, and tracking how you feel that morning. I think that's why I've really only stuck with what seems to work for me. I mean, I think it's been like 10 years. Like, I think I'll do jam on toast instead of peanut butter some days. What works. And then the night before, the 2 days before, I can't do a heavy thing of pasta. That was always the thing going through cross country season, load up on pasta. But I always found that that just messed with me more than anything else. Right. Do you have any tips for that day or 2 before, I guess, a race? Would you treat a race in a long run pretty similar with how you would prep? I would think you would, because that's ultimately where you're kind of doing the bulk of things.
Well, it's funny. I actually don't necessarily, only because I think you could really almost get, for me, I personally, I would get inside my head because I'm doing a long run pretty much every week. And if I'm planning
Mhm.
2 days before, then I'm really, for me personally, I would be almost overdoing it in terms of the planning and logistics. So I'm pretty much for my long runs, especially if it's not like a long run workout, if it's amount of time at conversational, easy pace, I'm probably just taking care of the dinner the night before. And like I was saying, prepping, making sure I have enough gels and everything. For race day, I'm definitely doing it 3 days before. I'm starting to really increase the carbohydrates. I think we may have mentioned this in a previous video, but carbohydrate loading and electrolyte hydration loading actually work together because carbohydrates, hydration, kind of like they blend well together in your body. So as you have more carbohydrates, you can actually have more electrolytes in your system too. So definitely, I mean, I'm not because also these races aren't cheap, so I'm definitely doing everything perfectly when we're dealing with race day or as much as I can. On a long run, I'm probably not doing that again, just because you're doing so many. You can almost get obsessive with it for myself and just knowing my
Yeah.
personality. So I'm really looking at the night before for a long run in reality. And you said it's not going to work well for everybody. I do. typically a similarity of some kind of pasta or rice situation, depending on if I've gotten a little bit annoyed with pasta. Both work really well for me. But man, I'll tell you, Julie, there's been times where I've had to totally change things up, and I've had killer workouts the day after eating pizza. So sometimes
That's a
these
good point.
things, this is the thing. Sometimes I was like, well, this is going to be an interesting run the next day, and it was great. So sometimes it's also your mind
Yeah.
playing tricks on you a little bit
Hmm.
too. But
Yeah.
again, like you said, it's trial and error what works well for certain people. But I think when you take these principles, gone into a long run and you've had no carbohydrates for 2 days, it's probably not going to go well. I'll say that. There
Hmm.
are some things that would be pretty hard fast in terms of those rules.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's funny you said that about the pizza. I think when you get used to just eating what you eat, when that's your body's used to that, then you could probably, before you go on your run. I was thinking back to just about these books I used to read. I forget the author. His books are kind of fun to read because he just experiments with things. Like he'll eat a whole pizza before he runs to see kind of how he does. And it is just, I mean, not that you should do that, but it just shows you that you don't have to be perfect with things.
And there's a key point again with this. You have to get your body to tolerate this. I know we talked about this in one of
Mhm.
I think it was the one where we talked about after my recent race and why people maybe don't fuel as much. It's like you have to train it. You really do. When I was
Mhm.
focusing more on 5K, 10K training, I didn't feel it all during a run because my long run was only 90 minutes. Could I have benefited from it? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but you
Mhm.
have to get your body to tolerate it. And every marathon I've done over the last year, I fueled more and my performance has been better. That's a little bit of confirmation bias because I'm also better
Mhm.
trained in terms of marathons and everything. But I think that in general, it comes from not just the fact that your body can use it, but if you went from having no gels in a long run and then you took six, you're probably not going to have a great time either, right? Like you haven't
Mhm.
developed that tolerance to be able to use it. And that's one thing too that I think is important for people to take away. Sometimes you're not fueling for that run. Sometimes you're fueling for race day. Just the ability to make sure you're taking it, practicing taking it. I know we mentioned that, opening those gel packets up when you're running if you are going to run
Mhm.
through the aid stations and when you're going to take it. But a real key aspect of it is getting your body to actually tolerate taking in fuel. I find that on a cool day, it's a lot easier. Again, I'm in Tampa and we don't have a ton of cool days, so it's a lot harder to fuel when it's hot out too. So getting your body tolerating that is a key aspect of this too.
Yeah, definitely. Good point. Now, you had brought up, we're going to bring this up here about an article about the carbs from 60, 90 to 120 grams with marathoners, which was through the mountains and kind of crazy course there. But it's an interesting articles like this because by the time I see runners who come to me, if they have something like a bone stress injury, or by talking to any runner, I ask about how their nutrition is. Majority of the time, they don't eat during their runs or don't have a good before meal, and then they're already into trouble at that point. So I think having resources like this, or just proof articles that you can give to someone without it being too overwhelming for that person, just helps to reinforce why you should be eating carbs, have a good balance of your macronutrients, but higher up on the carbs to keep yourself out of trouble. So, you okay if we dive into that article?
Let's do it. This is the stuff that I absolutely love doing for
Awesome.
sure.
Awesome. And I'm
And
sure there's so many more to check out too, just on the
it's
nutrition side. So,
And it's so funny because I just did a coaching certification here this past weekend, and it was really interesting, new things that come up. And it's funny, the lead instructor said the thing is, once it gets to these levels, there's so many studies that came out, there things are almost out of date as soon as you do it. So I would really encourage anybody, especially if maybe they're a coach or somebody that's really into this, really try to see if you can figure out some of these are where these things are coming from initially. And then people are putting them into practice. And then recommendations are really happening in terms of changing training. But it's interesting. Again, this broke down to 60, 90, and 120 grams of carbs per hour. And if there's anybody here that remembers, they used to think that 60 grams of carbs per hour was the limit, and we've doubled it now. And this study it's pretty recent and it's 2020 and they're calling for some additional research with this, but I think it's really interesting that we basically doubled the recommendation here when we used to think that 60 was the top end limit. So it's a really interesting look at this and how things can change very quickly.
it was 60 the top end limit for greater than 2 hours, would you say, or 2.5 hours?
I never really, there was a bunch of studies that looked at it, but basically they said that anything over than that, it would cause stomach distress. And there's a
Mm.
couple reasons for that, and we can get into that right now and how this has sort of evolved. They weren't really
Mhm.
looking at the difference between glucose and fructose. If you think about your table sugar at your house, that's two molecules. One of it's glucose, one of it's fructose. Your body breaks it down, and we can use both. We used to not really differentiate that. And so we were just getting 60 grams of carbohydrates, and anything more was causing stomach distress. Now, what we found is that your body kind of has two pathways or funnels for absorbing carbohydrates. This is how we got to 90. The glucose funnel is a little bigger. It's what can take 60. So that funnel's bigger. And then the fructose funnel is about half that size. You can take about 30 grams. So this is why if you look at your fueling strategies, if you look at it, most of those are going to say a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio. The better ones are going to have that ratio. And that means that you're in that those are pretty much all that way. You can see it called like there's new marketing terms for like dual action carbs, but it's the same basic thing is that you're getting glucose and fructose in a 2-to-1 ratio. What's really interesting when we looked at this, and this study did a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio. Pretty much all the new studies are coming out are doing that because that's with the big jump from 60 to 90 while you could tolerate 90 grams of carbohydrates in an hour. So this study looked at a 2-to-1 ratio too. And it was really kind of looking at what was happening to people in the race. They were looking at it, but this was, I think the authors were really great at this. They really looked at the limitations and everything, and they spelled all this out. And we'll put the link to this study in the appropriate places here for this video so you can find it and take a look at it. But I mean, this was people, they went out and they took people, it ended up being 26 people that were well-trained athletes. So these were not first timers. They were doing a trail marathon, which I think is a really interesting way of doing it. So it was considered like ultra. The distance was a marathon, but it was pretty steep climb. So there was strength and fairly short running. We're not dealing with like 100-mile races here. So it was a really good kind of cross section, although there were some pretty aggressive climbs in this, and looked at a bunch of different things. Now, what they were really setting out to do is to see what happened to muscle recovery if you took 120 grams of carbs versus there was a 60 grams of carbs per hour group, a 90, and 120. So those were the three groups, and they were randomized the way you would want them to be. They weren't putting any biases in where people were going, and they gave them the exact same thing. They pretty much, what was great, they really tracked everything. So you can actually look and see like the height differentials between the people in the groups and muscle mass, BMI, all these different things they took into account. They really did a great job with this study in terms of making sure things were balanced, including what they ate going into it in the days before, talking about carb loading. They actually made their own gels for this, so they weren't allowed to use their own gels. They made specific ones. Were encouraged to make sure they were getting all of the gel packets out. Water was not limited. They were able to take that throughout, but there was nothing else that they were taking during this, which I think is really interesting. The general takeaways when you look at it is that the 60-gram people performed not that much differently, a little bit less than the 90-gram people, but it was kind of interesting because the ages were slightly different. I'd say they were fairly even. The 90 gram per hour performed a little bit better. And then the 120 people were also pretty similar to the 90. So really what it took away was that they were not getting they weren't getting it, so much more performance during it. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway that 120 grams per hour were not necessarily doing it in the race. But what was really interesting in the day after, they did a couple tests to look at things like muscle strength, max and speed. They tracked lactate levels, so the ability to actually run fast enough to accumulate lactate, which not only showed, how much glucose was stored in their body to be able to use it, but the ability to run fast enough to produce it. And the 120 gram per hour people just crushed the other two groups. So they were, not back to baseline, but much, much more improved in terms of their performance in the day and the, subsequent days afterwards, which is really, really interesting in terms of muscle recovery. So not a huge real difference. It was very negligible between the 90 and the 120 group. But that's really interesting. Cause for more research in the amount of recovery that we get from carbohydrates. And this is what we were sort of talking about at the very beginning. We need to look at carbohydrates as more than just fuel. This is a recovery aid too. And you can go out and run fast enough to accumulate lactate the day after a trail marathon race. I don't know about you, Julie, but the day after a marathon, if I'm going to do any run, it's going to be a little joggy jog that's at super slow pace. I'm definitely not accumulating any lactate. So obviously that's meaning that all the things are there. The fueling was able to recover, the soreness, all these different things. They were looking at a bunch of different things, and it was for things
Mhm.
like simple, like quick motion, as well as fast running, strength, a lot of different things that really showed. And it was very telling. The 120 group, they weren't up to their pre race levels, but they were so much higher than the other two groups, which I think is really fascinating and can be practically put into place for runners,
Mhm.
both in their training as well as for their race day fueling potentially.
Yeah, no, I found that really interesting. The recovery part of it was huge. I think I some of the tests, I think doing those after that kind of race would have been super challenging for me, but
Yeah.
it was just amazing how well that 120 group did the recovery. So I think it easily translates over, even though it's an ultra. I mean, I think it easily translates over to your recreational runner, right? How you're going to feel that next day, and then the day after that is huge. So,
Yeah. And these people were all trained to do it, because I know taking 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour is not an easy thing. They were trained to do this going into it, which I think is also
mhm,
interesting. So again, this idea that these were not people that were low training or anything else like that. But the fact that this did, and they gave meals afterwards, so they were getting protein afterwards and all those different things to help. So it's not, I don't want people to think the other way and think, oh, I can just have carbohydrates and that's going to fuel
mhm,
all these different things. But a pretty good study of high level athletes too. There was a couple world champions, I think, that were in this group too.
mhm,
And so that was, I think, a really interesting thing. But yeah, the tests that they were watching can really go and even take a look at it. These tests, I
mhm.
don't think I could do them afterwards. Of course, I wasn't taking 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour in my most recent race. But I
So
will
maybe
say
you
this,
could.
maybe anecdotally, I actually felt better after last marathon here, Chicago, previous two, and I did take more carbohydrates during it. I definitely felt much less of the muscle soreness afterwards. Again, coming these more you do them, better you're going to get at it. Your body gets more tolerant to it. But I mean, these are things that you can really put into your practice, especially if you're stacking workouts. Maybe you do something.
Mhm,
I had one of my higher level runners do this last week who has a 9 to 5 that has to do a lot of work on the weekend. She did a 10K race on Saturday, 37 something, came back the next day and did an over 2 hour long run. We made sure that we were fueling all the way through this, taking some of these principles into mind, maybe not quite as rigid, but was able to come back on Monday, did all their normal stuff. We didn't have to really back off anything on them. And obviously, this is a high level runner, but the idea of having that extra fuel to recover from it, if for whatever reason, if you're somebody, and probably a lot of the people watching this are, that can't just go out and do their long run on Wednesday and separate their workouts so much, if you have to stack your workouts or do long run workouts, these much harder efforts, this is just more reason why another gel, more fuel during it is really going to be beneficial for not just your performance, as we're saying, because I would say most people are probably not taking 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour on their long runs or their long run workouts.
mhm.
That's a lot. But if you are going to go and do these different things, just putting some of these things into place could definitely allow you to see some of these benefits as well.
Yeah. No, that was great. Awesome. I mean, we kind of jumped into a lot on carbs. Do you feel like there's anything we haven't covered?
I think, go ahead.
No, I was saying I think we hit a lot, a good amount.
I think that the practical takeaway, because I always hesitate whenever we start looking at like what these optimized numbers are, is to just what
Mhm,
can someone take from this and actually use? What somebody watching this on YouTube could actually do for them. And again, if you're somebody that maybe is super sore the day after a long run or a harder, longer effort, if you're somebody that finds that, you're bonking at the end, this is just more reason to really look at what
mhm,
does your fueling strategy look like. Are you giving yourself enough carbohydrates before? Take a look at that. Never obsess over these things because we're doing these because we enjoy doing them, but is there something that maybe in the before, during, that could improve this? And it doesn't have to be 120 grams for you to see benefits from this. I think these are things that we can take away and say, maybe this is the optimal based on an academic study. How can we take this principle and make my own situation a little bit better? Because that's all we're really trying to do, right? That old saying of get
mhm.
1% better. If you improve things just a little bit, I think that most people are under fueling when it comes to this. And if you can take this and just make it a little bit better, that can improve your runs from one week to the next, to the next, to the next. You stack all these up, you can have better performance on race day, and you're going to be more likely and able to take more fuel during your race so that not only you can hit your goals, but you can come back and not be super fatigued, super sore. Take the time off that you need after a race. Again, I would not recommend doing what these people did in this study the day after a trail marathon. But if you're not sore, you're less likely to do something when you come back. You're less likely giving your body what it needs to recover. And I think that's a really key takeaway for a lot of people. But then also maybe just reframe the way we look at carbohydrates. It's more than just fuel, for myself included. It's more than just fuel in terms of actually running. It's fuel for how your body recovers. You can't just build, muscle or rebuild muscle just with protein. You have to give it all these other things. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that are coming out in terms of, fat glycol, breaking down fat for fuel and how that can benefit people too. This is just great that we're looking at all these different things. We're not just saying 60 grams of carbs, that's it, no more. Everybody's going to have a hurt stomach if we do it. These people are taking 120, and the authors are really saying, what is the limit? Where can we push this? We stopped at 120. Is it 140? Is it 150? Are these different things in terms of the limits? And how can we take those and actually practically apply them? Person looking to run their first marathon, set a PR, Boston qualify, all those different things.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, Kyle, I think that's a perfect way to end it. So I appreciate everything that you've dove into about carbs, and I hope this helps you watching. And we will have more on nutrition and more on everything else running coming in the near future.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle.
You're very welcome.